to be questioned. And so instead of having these standard norms, there's been a recent movement, perhaps led by Martin Dewey, to go towards context-specific norms, because he argues that there aren't any generic norms that apply across all contexts. How people use language depends on the context. And it's also this questioning of native speaker norms. And I'll look at how this has impacted English language teaching in a minute. But what we're doing today is we're suggesting a new view. We're still being instrumental, but we're not looking so much at who you're using language with as to what you're doing. We're focusing on using language to do things. And here, as with ELF, there may be context-specific norms, but there may also be no norms at all. From languaging, you remember we were not looking at norms as product, we're looking at language as a process. So it may be the case that there are no norms, or it may be the case in some contexts that there are context-specific norms. And I'll give you examples of how these work in a few minutes. But going back to English as a lingua franca, English as a lingua franca fits with the idea of the world in disruption, that the world is changing rapidly, and so we need to be flexible. And it argues that we need to be flexible in how we communicate, and we need to teach students to be flexible, because they're not just trying to meet native speaker norms anymore. They may be communicating with other people who don't meet native speaker norms. And so perhaps the most influential area of ELF in how to teach is possibly within the idea of language use strategies. Now, when you hear strategies, you might think of things like learning strategies and Oxford's strategy inventory for language learning, metacognitive, cognitive, etc. We're not talking about learning strategies here. We're talking about language use strategies. One type of this, which has received attention in ELF, is going back to the 1980s, 1990s, when there was work on communication strategies. And that has re-emerged in ELF as to how people negotiate meaning. And yes, communication strategies is one type of language use strategy. But within languaging, we're taking a much broader view of language use strategies. Most of the work in ELF is on face-to-face spoken communication. There is some work on writing, yes, but most of it is on speaking. And in speaking, yes, you use communicative strategies. But what about reading from an ELF perspective? Things like that are almost totally ignored in the ELF literature. But there are language use strategies about how to read, how to approach reading. And these are the kinds of strategies that we're looking at in languaging curriculum. As I said, I'll look briefly at how ELF has influenced English language teaching. And Hino and Oda wrote a nice article which reviews approaches which have been used to integrate ELF into language teaching. And they suggest there are 5 main approaches here. You teach about ELF, or you give exposure to ELF, or you get students to do ELF role plays, which I'm not very sure how this works. If you've got a class where everyone is Thai, it's very difficult to do an ELF role play. I'm afraid I don't understand how content-based teaching fits into this, but they listed it. But the key one for me here, and the key one we're drawing on in languaging curriculum, is this participation in communities. Some ELF people argue that to teach ELF, you have to get the students to participate in the actual communities. And we're emphasizing that a lot in the languaging curriculum. the languaging curriculum is wholly based on communicating authentically in the real world for real world purposes. Because from a languaging perspective, the goal is to help students do things in English. If they're doing things, they must be real things. So we're looking at authentic communication in real world contexts. So there's very little of the fake communication in the classroom. We have almost no classroom practice. Everything is aiming towards real world language use. And to see, so that this is one way in which ELF is influencing our ideas on the languaging curriculum. I also mentioned that ELF talks a little bit about context-specific norms, and within languaging, we may have no norms or we may have context-specific norms. And to show you why we need to be looking at context-specific norms, I'll give you an example from myself. From a traditional 20th century perspective, I am a model for English learners from that perspective. I'm a native speaker and I was brought up as a monolingual native speaker. I don't have a strong regional accent and I am highly educated. So therefore, from a 20th century perspective, in many ways, I am the model of what we should be getting our students to try to achieve. And because I'm the model, surely I don't need to learn English, surely. But I do need to learn English. I constantly need to learn English because as soon as I enter a context I'm not familiar with, I need to learn how language is used in that context. And as an example from a few months ago, I was writing an application for a project and it asked me to write a 150-word marketing statement. So I sat down and I wrote a 150-word marketing statement and I was proud of it. And I sent it to my two colleagues who I was working on the project application with. And one of them said, yes, the ideas are good, but it doesn't sound like marketing language. It sounds academic. Because of my job, because of my experience, I spend a lot of time writing academic English. And when I was asked to write a marketing statement, I drew on my norms of academic English to create my marketing statement. And as my colleague pointed out, it wasn't marketing. So I needed to learn the English of marketing, even though I'm an educated native speaker who should be a model under traditional ideas. So I managed to find marketing statements from other projects which had previously been successful in the context I was working with. I analyzed them, I looked through them, I looked at how they phrased things, I looked at how they organized things, and I rewrote my statement. And I sent it back to my colleagues, and I'm very happy that one of my colleagues now thinks I might be a marketing expert. I had learned the norms which were context specific to marketing. This is the issue. There is no real generic English that we need to teach everyone. A lot of English use is context specific, and we change the way we use language depending on the context. So what we need to be teaching is this flexibility and this ability to use language in new contexts for new genres. And to some extent, this comes from the idea of English as a lingua franca. So, but we're taking it beyond ELF in that we're arguing that in some contexts, there are no norms. And since there are no norms, you can't have any linguistic objectives. You can't set predetermined language goals that you're going to teach. And this, again, this fits with languaging where language is a process, not a product. Where norms exist, they're context specific. So we need to be, if we're going to be teaching traditionally with language objectives, we'd have to be teaching a different set of objectives for each context, which is clearly very difficult to do and probably completely impractical. So basically under languaging, we don't pay any attention to the forms. We're looking at the meanings, and we're emphasizing how people do things in English, how they convey meanings. We're not looking at the language they use. So to help them do this, we need to support them with language use strategies, which we've drawn from ELF to some extent. So as you saw with my example of writing a marketing statement, I found some existing successful models. I analyzed them, I learned from them, and I drew on them to write my own statement. And so that became something where I was learning a new context. And we're also looking at language use strategies, going back to what I said about technological tools. How do you use resources and tools to support successful language use? So rather than teaching language objectives, we're teaching people strategies of how to use language. And these ideas partly come from ELF. Moving on to my third question, which was how to teach English. And here I'm going to suggest 6 interrelated principles which I believe should guide us as teachers in how we teach. And here they are. We should be highlighting why English is important. We should be encouraging students to do things in English so they would want to do things in English, and for that highlights the importance of English. And I think Ajahn Ronagrit Ong will talk a little bit about this in the hobby course about how we highlight the importance of English. We want to raise their confidence. We want students to be trying. If students aren't confident, they don't try to use English. If they're completely unconfident, they will just shut up. And if they don't try, they're not going to learn. So we need to help them become confident in using English so that they will try, and then they can learn from mistakes, they can learn from successes, they can learn from failures. But they need to have some level of confidence to be able to try so that they will be able to learn. We would like them to be motivated. So if students aren't motivated, they're not going to pay attention. And attention and noticing theory and all those things within SLA are important. We would like to promote mastery orientations. The opposite of a mastery orientation is a performance orientation. And this is related to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. A mastery orientation is where you do things because you want to do them. A performance orientation is where you do things because you want to get a good grade. You want a reward of some kind. Rewards and grades are short-term, and there's a lot of literature in educational psychology which argues against the use of rewards for performance, because it keeps students at a certain level. So we want to get students to be doing things because they want to do things, which is promoting mastery orientations. We would like them to feel proud of their English. So we need to create a sense of achievement. If you feel proud, you're going to be trying harder, you're going to be more motivated, etc. And perhaps most importantly, we want to encourage students to be using English in the long term. We want to encourage them to use English outside class extensively. And again, recent articles suggest that maybe the out of class exposure is more important than inside class. Outside class can give a lot more exposure than in class. Vocabulary knowledge is easy to measure, so Peter's looked at it comparing how students' exposure to English language media, watching films, reading English language websites, etc., and found that had a much, much larger impact on their vocabulary than in the classroom. So we would like to be able to encourage students to continue using English outside the class. These all sound great, and I'm sure you're thinking, yes, this is highly idealistic, but impractical. But I'll show you the sorts of things how we would link these ideals of how to teach to actual things that happen within the classroom. So to help people become awareness of the importance of English, we want to expose them to real world English and to show them how English might help them achieve their real world goals. To raise their confidence, we need to be non-judgmental. Traditionally, teachers love red pens and they tick and cross, and that's one of their main jobs, is to tell students where they're wrong. But here we're looking at success in the real world, and we are not probably the best people to judge whether something is successful in the real world. The people the students are communicating with in the real world are better judges of success. So as teachers, we have to be a lot more non-judgmental. We'd like to promote motivation, so we give students choice of what they want to study, of what they want to work on, of the things they want to do in English. As students choose the things they're interested in, they have a personal investment in what they're doing. And they are more motivated because they're personally invested in what they're doing. And because they're doing these things in the real world and there are authentic outcomes, they're far more likely to have mastery orientations than performance orientations. They're not writing assignments to give to the teachers for a grade. They're writing in the real world to do things that they want to do in the real world. They're authentic outcomes. And yes, you may think that my students would never be able to do anything successfully in the real world. To help them achieve, to help them become successful, we provide scaffolds. So again, you'll see examples of all these things a little bit later. So the third main principle we're working from is experiential learning. The things we're doing in languaging are authentic real-world communication for the student's own goals. 40 years ago, this was almost impossible to do. You'd have to set up pen pals and things like that. Since 2000, it's become easier and easier because of Web 2. With Web 2 applications, everyone communicates, everyone produces knowledge, enables real-world communication for personal goals easily. So this has now become possible. 20 years ago, it would have been very difficult. And to help people, because real-world communication can be daunting, we provide macro scaffolds and micro scaffolds. Macro scaffolds are how the whole course outline is structured to provide support through the course to reach the end goals. Micro scaffolds are our support to solve small problems at particular points in the course. And again, I think we'll see examples of these in the coming hours. And finally, we'd like to promote reflection, because to gain the most benefits from the experiences of real-world communication for personal goals, students will gain more benefits when they reflect on their experiences and think about how their experiences worked, how they affected them, how they And so this is all about learning from experience. So we encourage students to write reflective journals. So we have these three key principles feeding into the languaging curriculum: languaging from linguistic philosophy, English as a lingua franca, and experiential learning. And from that, we would like to define the languaging curriculum as learning to strategically make use. Remember, language use strategies, the available tools, use automated translation. I use it when I'm communicating in Thai. Why do we stop students using it when they're communicating in English? Use resources. But the main thing is, the goal is doing things successfully in English for real world purposes. So this is our definition of the languaging curriculum. And what this means in practice is we can set up a few do's and don'ts about how things should work in the classroom. We're focusing on doing things with English. We're not focusing on the English language. There are no predetermined language objectives. Everything is about doing things, which means that we're focusing on being successful, not focusing on accuracy. And because it's doing things, we're focusing on a process. We don't look at English language as the product. It's the whole process of how you do things successfully is the full focus. And key to this are the language use strategies. We pay almost no attention to language forms. Now, you might be thinking that students are just going to produce horribly inaccurate language and think they're doing well. This depends on the context. We will provide strategies for how to make your language more accurate. And I think Ajahn Stewart will talk about this quite a bit. But we won't, it's not that we're setting a language form to be learned this lesson. We don't know what language form students will need because each student has chosen their own personal goal. But what we need to do is to provide strategies to help students become more accurate if accuracy is needed in that context. Everything is about real world use. Students are free to choose what to do. There are almost no fixed activities that everyone does in the classroom together and everyone reading the same text. That almost doesn't happen in the languaging curriculum. It's all about giving students choice to do the things they want to do, and we want to make them feel comfortable in doing it. Quite a bit of traditional language teaching makes students feel anxious, and when their anxiety can be debilitating, we want to make students feel comfortable so they can be successful. So I'd like to give a little bit of a metaphor of what this means for how we teach. So I'm going to give a metaphor of children's football. And I would argue that traditional English language teaching is like formal football games for children. There's a referee, and the referee ensures that the children follow the rules of football. They're playing on a formal pitch with formal goals. They have two sides in different uniforms. Everything is about following rules. And to some extent, this isn't actually much fun for the kids, to some extent. The kids don't have as much fun playing football where the teacher is the referee and is blowing the whistle all the time. And that's what traditional ELT is like. If you let kids have a bit of freedom, often they'll be more like this. And I would argue that the Wikipedia course, the third of the courses that you'll hear about today, is more like this. This is clearly recognizable as football. It's vaguely following the rules of football. But there aren't any goalposts. People use jackets for goalposts. The edges of the pitch are unclear. Even who's on which team might be unclear. There may not even be two teams. It's everyone playing against the goalkeeper to try to score. The rules are a lot more flexible, but they still exist. There's still a shared understanding of expectations, but it's not rigid. There's still some flexibility, and kids seem to enjoy playing football like this a lot. But sometimes if you leave kids totally alone, you end up with something like this. There's a football, there are children, but I have no idea what it has to do with the traditional football goals. The kids have made up their own rules. Here, there's a skipping rope involved in the football. I don't know what's happening. I have no understanding of what's happening here. A lot of social media works in this way. If you don't use that social media regularly, you've no idea about how you're supposed to perform in that social media. This is more like the hobby course, which Ajahn Ong will talk about in a few minutes. And it's not clear what the rules are. In fact, we might as well forget rules and just enjoy ourselves. So the languaging curriculum, we're getting away from this rule-bound, teacher-dictated traditional ELT to being far more students are either vaguely following rules or making up their own rules. There are concerns. It's not perfect. We acknowledge it's not perfect. There are problems with the languaging curriculum. And I'd just like to talk through these problems a little bit. A key one is about assessing students. Most of us work in formal institutions where assessment is a major concern. And there's problems with assessing students in languaging. Remember, we're not looking at accuracy. There are not necessarily any norms to follow. What we're looking at is success in doing things. And it's problematic. How do you measure success? This is somewhat problematic. How can you measure success in doing things? I don't think we found the answer properly yet, but we're doing research into this and we're working on it. And hopefully, if any of you want to implement languaging, we'd be very happy to work with you in trying to work out issues of assessment, because this is still a concern with the languaging curriculum. And it's also partly a concern because every student is doing something different. Because students are making personal choices of the things they want to do in English, every student does something different. There's no common core that the whole class is following in a traditional way. And this means that teachers need to be quite flexible, because you don't know what problems your students are going to be encountering today. You've got to be flexible and open, because every student's doing something different. So it needs a shift in teacher mindset. And we acknowledge that some teachers find this shift in teacher mindset quite difficult. So we believe that it's important that students do the things they want to do for motivation. Since every student is doing something different, this adds another element of problems with assessment and evaluation. Because students are doing different things, there is some level of unreliability in assessment. Some students may be doing 2 or 3 times the amount of work of another student. How do we compare these? Again, this is a problem with assessment, and we haven't solved these problems yet, hopefully. Another issue is the choice of topic. I've been saying we want to encourage students to do the things they want to do. But we've learned that we need some constraints. There are some choices of topic that are likely to end in failure, that are likely to lead to major problems. And so we need to have a few constraints about the choice of topic. What we found is when we set up these constraints, we normally find that 90% of the students are fine. They can do their first choice. Maybe 10%, we tell them that the first choice is likely to end up as being problematic. So we encourage them to make a second choice. And some students get a little bit frustrated about this. You may think there's a potential for copying here. And yes, there is a potential for copying. We acknowledge that. If you think about the example I gave of the marketing statement, I found model marketing statements, analyzed them, and drew on them to make my own marketing statement. If we're encouraging students to do these sort of things, why don't they just copy from their models? But yes, copying plays a role. If maybe your boss asks you to write a new style of formal letter that you've never written before, you're probably going to be looking for examples of this to help you. And you will probably take key phrases from the example to help you write your own. But what you're doing is you're copying with understanding and purpose. Vygotsky argued that there were several different types of copying, and he would understand this. He would call this copying with understanding and purpose imitation. Imitation is a useful skill in using language. The problems come when you do mimicry, where you blindly copy and paste without reading. And yes, we strongly want to discourage mimicry. And there have been some occasions, especially with things like the Wikipedia course, we probably need to ask students to put their Wikipedia pages through Turnitin before they upload them, because there may be issues of copying and we need to cater for that. But generally, for example, in the hobby course, I think we found absolutely zero examples of clear blind mimicry. So there is a certain type of copying that's useful, but you don't want to get it to too much copying. You need copying with understanding and purpose, not blind copying. And finally, some teachers may be worried about our lack of accuracy. I've said we're not looking at accuracy at all. And this because accuracy only becomes important in certain contexts. In the hobby course, accuracy is not an issue at all. And we pretty much ignore accuracy and say there are no norms. In the Wikipedia course, accuracy is an issue. A certain level of accuracy is needed. But instead of teaching accurate forms, we teach strategies for how to be accurate. So there is some dealing with accuracy depending on the context. And we would also argue that if we can get students to get large amounts of exposure to English, then they will become more accurate slowly through exposure based on the constructs of usage-based linguistics and things like that. Emergentism issues, theories like that from second language acquisition would apply here. So we want to by getting students to be comfortable and confident in using English, they use English more and more outside the classroom, and that extra exposure helps them slowly become more accurate. So yes, there are still problems with the language in curriculum. We're not saying it's a panacea for everyone. But I think we've seen that it is actually very effective in several ways. And to finish, I'd like to talk about some of the outcomes of the language in curriculum. As I've mentioned several times, we want to encourage students to be comfortable to get out of class exposure to English in the future. And for the hobby course, the first time we ran the hobby course, we got back in touch with the students 6 months after the course had finished and asked them how many of them were still using the English resources. And 63% of the students said they were still doing the things which they'd done on the hobby course by themselves outside class afterwards. To me, that's possibly the biggest success of the language in curriculum, because they're going to learn so much more from that than they will learn in our classrooms. Other outcomes, we can look at student quotations from their reflective diary, from their reflective journals. Students are clearly aware that they're doing things. The whole goal of the English is doing things. We don't explicitly state that, but they become aware of this. They see that they're always doing things. They're not just listening to boring lectures. And because of this, they see a language in curriculum as being ideal. They realize that this is fun, it's interesting, it's motivating. And they also see that it's actually a new paradigm. They see that it contrasts clearly with previous courses they've studied. And that this may be helpful for most of our students. They've studied English for 12, 14 years before they come into our classroom. And their English is not necessarily good. They realize that this is a completely different way that may be helpful. And a final quotation, which makes us all feel very good, is that this is one of the great subjects that I've learned. With quotations like these, we believe that the language in curriculum is worth sharing. So here I've presented the underlying principles behind the language in curriculum. As we move on through the morning, we will you'll see how these are put into practice more clearly. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint in a moment. I'll share the PowerPoint that I've just been using. So you can have a look at that. And I also mentioned that we've got the 3 courses. There is a website where all of the materials, all lesson plans for all 3 courses are available, which we've also put into the chat. As I mentioned, we're not going to look at questions now. Please jot down your questions. If you have any questions about what I just presented, please post them in the chat and we will deal with them at the end. But for now, we'll just have a 2-minute break. So you can download the PDF, maybe you can open the website for the courses, etc. And in 2 minutes' time, Jan Ong will start talking to you about the hobby course to show you how the principles I presented are actually applied in practice. Thank you.